Hello, today we're looking at capital punishment. You're going to have two PowerPoints for this. The first video is just going to talk about some of the basic introductory concepts to kind of give us a feel for what the deal is with capital punishment in terms of what the legal status is in the United States and worldwide, how the United States compares to some other countries in the world, and then what the main moral approaches to this issue are in the West, specifically pertaining to this issue of capital punishment. So the death penalty worldwide is on the decline. As you can see here, this is a map from 2012 of capital punishment in which we have the number of death sentences that have been handed down. Those are in blue, and then the number of executions are in the sort of purplish color. So China doesn't report numbers, but we do know that they perform a lot of executions, probably in the thousands. You can see here it says they refuse to divulge figures on its use of the death penalty, but we do have a lot of reports of many executions happening in China. One thing that I want to point out that you might notice on this map is that the United States and some of the Caribbean islands are the only locations in the Western Hemisphere, North America area that still have the death penalty. In the rest of the world, we have lots of locations in Africa and Asia, and one country in Europe, Belarus. But for the most part, when we're talking about the most wealthiest and powerful nations in the world, we have nations that do not use the death penalty, except for the United States. So the United States is unusual in that regard, in that we're the only sort of highly developed nation in the world that still uses the death penalty. In the United States, it is a state-by-state issue. So when we talk about the death penalty in the United States, we need to get a little bit more specific. So here we have a map that shows there's a poll result over there on the left that shows people have changing views on the death penalty. But the main thing that I want you to notice is this map here, where we have several states where the death penalty has been abolished. And then the death penalty is legal, but as we'll see in the next map, used with different levels of frequency in these states that are the darker blue. And then we have 3 states in which the governor of those states has imposed a moratorium on the death penalty. That means they haven't rendered it illegal yet, but they're not conducting any executions right now. So the idea here is just to illustrate that in the United States, individual states have a whole lot of power to determine whether they're going to use the death penalty or not. And this is definitely an issue that varies state by state. So if you're familiar with U.S. politics at all, you can probably already guess which state it is on this map that has carried out the most executions since the death penalty was confirmed in 1976 as a legitimate form of punishment. So what happened in the United States is that there was a nationwide moratorium on it that was based on the legal question of whether it constituted cruel and unusual punishment. That case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the death penalty was reintroduced on a state-by-state basis in 1976. So from 1976 to 2013, I think these figures are from, these are the number of executions that have been carried out in each state. So again, the states that are in light blue, they don't have the death penalty. There's one execution in New Mexico that occurred before that state abolished the death penalty. But the state of Texas is pretty notorious for having a very high number of executions, followed closely by Virginia, which is where we are here in Lynchburg. And then you have a lot of other states with relatively low numbers, but you can see that it's really concentrated, with the exception of Ohio, in the southern portion of the United States. So this just gives you an idea about how the figures are skewed, and in terms of convicts, people who are convicted of capital offenses that would make them eligible for the death penalty. You can see how committing the same crime in various parts of the country might lead to very different outcomes depending on where your trial was located. So there are some justice concerns pertaining to capital punishment in the United States. These are sometimes considered ethical concerns. They're also sometimes considered practical concerns. So I'm just going to lay them out for you here and let you decide how you want to take these into account. The first is that there is known to be a lot of bias in the U.S. legal system. And then the second that we'll talk about is the high risk of wrongful conviction in some instances. So to get to the first issue of bias in the U.S. legal system, what we're talking about here is documented instances in terms of the frequency with which certain populations are arrested, charged with crimes, actually convicted of those crimes. In other words, they're tried and found guilty, and then the number of those convictions that result in a recommendation for capital punishment. So there's a very, very strong bias in the United States legal system against African American males. Now, this sometimes has to do with who police officers are inclined to look for when they're looking for a culprit in a crime. Again, sometimes once the law enforcement officials have arrested and detained the correct person, they might be more likely to press charges against an African American male compared to a member of another group of the population. Once that case goes to trial, we also have biases in lawyers and the juries. So in general, African American males are depicted by prosecuting attorneys and are seen by law enforcement officers as dangerous to society. And that leads them to engage in practices that result in this skewing of the legal system against them. There's also a bias against people who do not have resources to pay for their own legal team. And there's another bias against the poor that kind of overlaps with this bias against African American males. So that if you have people who don't have a lot of resources at their disposal to defend themselves, they're relying on the public defender, who sometimes isn't going to do as well as someone who's been explicitly hired by that defendant. So all of this comes together to create very disproportionate rates of arrest, conviction, and death penalty recommendations. So what we mean by that last one is sometimes a case will go to trial, the person will be found guilty, but the jury gets to decide whether they're going to recommend the death penalty for that person or whether they're going to recommend life in prison with or without the possibility of parole. What we found is even when you control for the same type of crime committed, African American males are more likely to have the death penalty recommended as the appropriate punishment compared to other groups. So you can see that there's a problem here in the U.S. legal system with bias. The other issue is the risk of wrongful conviction. In 2011, the state of Illinois, the governor of Illinois, abolished the death penalty following a moratorium. And that was based on the revelation that 20 death row prisoners had been exonerated. What that means is they had been convicted of crimes that are punishable by death. They had been placed on death row, and 20 of those individuals were later found to be not guilty. So the reason why the governor of Illinois decided to ultimately abolish the death penalty was that he determined that the risk of executing innocent people was simply too high. So if we have these 20 people that we know because their cases were re-examined and they were in fact exonerated, if we have 20 people who may have been killed unjustly and unfairly for a crime that they didn't commit, we simply have no way of knowing how many people that had been executed since 1976 in Illinois were also not guilty, were wrongfully arrested or convicted of similar crimes. So in order to avoid the risk of executing more innocent people, the state of Illinois decided to abolish the death penalty. So some people view these, as I said, as important justice concerns that are also moral concerns. In other words, these are things that would raise serious moral concerns about the death penalty and also about the way our legal system functions here in the United States. Other people view these more as practical concerns, things that can be fixed about the legal system that they think may not actually speak to the real morality of the death penalty itself. So in that line of reasoning, yes, it is a big problem that there's bias in the legal system, but the problem is that we need to fix that bias. That isn't a problem with the death penalty, according to this perspective. That is a problem with the legal system and the inherent racism in it that we would need to fix. Similarly, you could depict the risk of wrongful conviction as a practical issue. This is definitely a big problem that we need to address. But the fact that people are wrongfully convicted, some might argue, doesn't mean that the death penalty is wrong. It means that we have to be a lot better at applying it accurately. So these, again, are just some concerns that I want you to keep in the back of your mind as food for thought as we work through some of the ethical arguments for and against the death penalty that we're going to see here today. Okay, so to get to some more explicit ethical arguments pertaining to the death penalty, these are usually divided into two different categories, forward-looking and backward-looking arguments. Now, when we say forward-looking, we don't mean like wonderful and progressive and innovative. We just mean looking into the future. So the forward-looking arguments are going to look into the future and see what good or bad things might come from having the death penalty, consequences. Whereas the backward-looking arguments are looking into the past. So those aren't backward as in less progressive. They're just backward as in we're looking back at something that happened before. So the forward-looking arguments want to examine the idea of whether the death penalty is a deterrent. In other words, does it deter these types of crimes from happening in our society? So the first author that you read for today, Byrne, is assuming that the death penalty is in fact a deterrent in a few different ways. So the idea here is that we know for sure that the individual who's been executed will definitely not commit any more crimes. But the more important issue here is whether it stops other people from committing similar crimes. That's usually what we're talking about when we're examining the issue of whether or not the death penalty is a deterrent. So I have, it may stop others from committing similar crimes, and I do have that word may in italics, although it may be hard for you to see that. We just don't know. We have no idea of knowing whether there are lots of people who would commit crimes if we didn't have the death penalty compared to the number of people who commit those types of crimes now. There's just no way to get accurate data on that. If you ask people, would you murder someone if you knew you would get away with it, most people aren't going to give you an accurate answer. So the best we can do there is to compare the murder rates state by state between states that do and don't have the death penalty. States that don't have the death penalty actually usually have lower murder rates than states that do have the death penalty. There are a lot of complicating factors there, though, like the size of that state's population, the demographics of that state, the poverty level, all kinds of other factors that might play into that. So this is definitely an unknown, and it is a fact that we would like to know, but that we just aren't able to gather good data on. And then we have the idea that Byrne also talks about that it also might support moral norms that deter people from violent acts. In other words, what we're doing, according to Byrne and others, when we have harsh punishments like the death penalty, is we're saying these are the crimes we take really, really seriously, and we're establishing we're communicating a moral message by having very harsh punishments for those crimes. Again, this is a speculative statement and there's no way to prove it, which is why I have the word may there in italics instead of that it definitely does support those moral norms. So to move on to the backward-looking arguments, we saw with the forward-looking arguments that we're trying to create good things in the future by deterring people from committing bad crimes. The backward-looking arguments are a little different. In the backward-looking arguments, we're not talking about deterring other people who might do bad things in the future. We're talking about holding people responsible for things they have done in the past. So backward-looking arguments are arguments about retribution, about holding people responsible for their actions. And the main question here is whether retribution, holding people responsible for their actions, does that require execution of certain criminals? So one important thing to keep in mind here is that retribution is not the same thing as revenge. Revenge is usually carried out by a single person, not by law enforcement or the legal system. And revenge is usually fueled by emotions like anger or sadness, hurt over what someone has done to you. We don't let private citizens take revenge on other private citizens as a way to resolve legal wrongs that have been committed. And the reason for that is that would be very disproportionate. If someone harmed one of my children, I would want to inflict a much worse harm on them than what they did to my child. And then we're going to have things get very out of hand very quickly. So when we talk about retribution as carried out by the law, it's not a form of revenge, but it is a form of holding a person responsible and requiring them to pay in some way for a wrongful act that they did commit. So retribution is just holding someone responsible for a past action. So one thing we need to think about here is whether capital punishment is the only way to do this or is the most appropriate way to do this, or whether there are other penalties that are proportional to the crime committed. So one of your discussion forum questions for today asks you to consider life in prison without the possibility of parole compared to the death penalty, and to think about which one of those you find to be a worse punishment. There is not agreement on this. There are some people who say they would rather just be executed than have to live in prison for the rest of their lives. So this is another question that we're not going to be able to get a true factual answer on because it involves so much speculation and personal opinion. So questions that I want you to keep in mind and consider going forward now that you've had this little introduction is whether we need the death penalty in order to maintain order. So this is what Burns is kind of hinting at in his first article, right? That we need this. We need harsh punishments in order to get people to obey the law. Think back to that first map that I showed you, which shows a lot of very stable nations and states within the United States that don't have the death penalty. And try to keep that in mind as you think this through. Those are not nations with moral chaos, right? Now, there are people there who commit violent acts, but we know that those are also very stable societies in those countries that don't have the death penalty. Another question is whether we need the death penalty to hold people accountable. So this is a different issue, right? In the first question, we're talking about whether we need to control society by having a harsh punishment like the death penalty. In the second question, what we're talking about is whether this is the only or best way to hold people accountable for their own actions. Thirdly, to get on to some of the questions that the second author, Nathanson, is talking about, does the death penalty degrade human dignity? In other words, are we doing something that is inherently disrespectful to humanity as a whole when we execute people, when we kill them intentionally? And then finally, does killing criminals reduce us, society at large, to their status? In other words, when we find someone guilty of murder and we punish them by ending their lives, does that make us just like them? So these are some questions that we'll continue to talk about in the next video when we look at some arguments pro and con on the death